such a problem. To you, Suhasini. Yeah.
Yes, okay. Hello, everyone. I welcome you all on behalf of TheDaak to our 47th Baithak and 9th book discussion. TheDaak began in 2023 as a book review journal publishing original reviews across disciplines and genres. From the start, we sought to reimagine the form of the book review, encouraging writing that moves beyond summaries to engage deeply, reflectively, and creatively with the world a book opens up. Over time, we grew into a biannual academic journal that now includes reviews, explainers, commentaries, and each issue is built around a central theme, bringing together diverse voices that explore intersections across the social sciences. Our double-blind peer review process ensures rigor, while our editorial approach values accessibility and creative thought. Beyond the journal, TheDaak has grown into a vibrant collective. Through our reading groups, we meet every month to discuss a shared book, discovering new perspectives through conversation. Through TheDaak Weekly, we publish personal essays, topical reflections, and explainers that extend our conversations into the present moment. TheDaak Baithak is our humble attempt to connect scholars, writers, and students from different fields to share ideas, spark meaningful dialogue, and bring critical conversations to life. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Ankita Pandey, Associate Professor of Political Studies at O.P. Jindal Global University and a Research Associate at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, University of Oxford. She joins us to discuss her recently published book, Becoming Allies, Civil Liberties Activism in India, published by the Cambridge University Press. I'm going to take the opportunity to show my copy because I have one. So this is the book. Dr. Pandey's work intervenes in the existing literature on social movements to argue that civil liberties activism in India constitutes a distinct form of collective action. Rather than viewing social movement politics as a binary conflict between a movement and the state, her research introduces the concept of a movement ecosystem. This framework highlights the crucial yet often overlooked role played by allies in amplifying demands raised by marginalized sections of society. Dr. Pandey, thank you so much for being with us here today, and the floor is now all yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the TheDaak team and to Suhasini for coordinating this. And also thank you to everyone who has joined on Saturday evening. As you can see, this is the book, and I want to talk a little bit about 2 or 3 themes from the book. In fact, 2 chapters, a little bit focusing on them. Maybe I should start by saying that when I began working on civil liberties groups in India, I thought I was writing the history of an overlooked social movement in our country. And I imagined that I would be studying groups such as the People's Union for Civil Liberties, the People's Union for Democratic Rights, and the Association for the Protection of Democratic Rights, or CFD, Citizens for Democracy, groups like that. And there was not much on this in the history of social science scholarship. So I expected to kind of, reconstruct their histories through the experiences of their activists and to contribute to social movement studies. But very early on in the project, 2 things happened. One, I realized that the groups themselves are not actually the most interesting part of the story. I also realized that you can't write a comprehensive history of any activism over all these decades across this vast country. But I also began feeling that it was not quite right to think of them as yet another social movement. And let me show you a couple of images to make this point. So on slide 2, slide 3, for example, let's look at slide 3. Slide 3, you can see a still from the protest that happened after the 2012 gang rape case in Delhi. For example, you can see an image from the anti-CAA protest. Slide 5, you can see a protest, an image from a protest of the farmers' movement on the Sonipat-Singhu border. And slide 6, you can see an image from the very well-known Narmada Bachao Andolan, people who are protesting against the creation of the dam. Now, slide 7, you see all of these 4 photos. Keep these in mind and as images of what constitutes a social movement. Now, in contrast, have a look at the next 4 pictures. In the next a bunch of people talking to the press. This is the People's Union for Civil Liberties. They are addressing the press. You can see some fact-finding reports on the table. The next image might actually make it clearer. You'll see a bunch of fact-finding reports on the table. They have looked at the gang rape and sort of case of violence in Hathras. They've done an independent fact-finding and they are sharing their findings with the press. Or on the next slide, it's a case of the People's Union for Democratic Rights approaching the court to ensure that construction sites in the context of the Asiad Games in Delhi. This is 1980s. The next slide is also very interesting to me. On the next slide, you see what is called a People's Tribunal. So retired judges from the high courts and the Supreme Court are hearing victims who is narrating the incident of a police firing in Arwal, Bihar on a protesting crowd. So the situation is that the police has fired on a protesting crowd. Members who are affected, victims, are narrating their version of the story to a translator who then translates it into English to the judges and they are recording it. So people's tribunals actually mirror official tribunals and there's a very rich history of people's tribunals in the country. And the next slide, you see a report that has been compiled by the People's Union for Civil Liberties of abuses of power of the UAPA Act between 2009 to 2022. So all of the cases, all of the situations when extrajudicial violence or abuse of power by law enforcement, members of the law enforcement agencies were conducted. Now, if you see on the next slide, think of all of these 4 images together. When you do that, you will notice a couple of things. One, there is a lack of mass participation that stands out in these 4 images as opposed to the previous 4 social movement images that you had seen. Then there is the fact that while most movements in the first few images, you notice that they will stick to one issue or a set of closely aligned issues. Women's movement or the Bachao Andolan, or it is the youth or against movement against corruption, etc. You will see one issue or a set of closely aligned issues. But civil liberties groups seem to be casting their net really wide. They are representing or they are trying to engage with a very wide variety of issues, and I'll say a little bit more about this later. Thirdly, the bit that strikes me is that the missing affected segment of the movement. These are people who are not directly impacted by the cause they are intervening in. And during my field work, again and again, I encountered individuals and practices that were engaged with struggles that did not directly affect them. I met lawyers who had done pro bono, defending of political prisoners. I met, and these are political prisoners whose politics the lawyers did not necessarily share. I have met academics who were traveling around the country to investigate cases of police firings on activists who have documented custodial torture, encounter killings, administrative mishandling of communal violence, and very often involving communities to which they themselves did not belong. And one couldn't immediately see a direct material benefit to them. Now, of course, I'm not saying that this is some, altruistic work. Of course, I can see that engaging in this kind of activism is deeply rewarding for them. And to be able to live out your politics is deeply rewarding in itself. But the pattern prompted a question in me, which I think has received very little systematic analytical attention. And that question is, why do people become politically invested in struggles that they... So the book begins with a conceptual shift. Now I'm no longer thinking of them as yet another movement. Instead of thinking of civil liberties groups as an instance of yet another social movement, I began to argue that their defining characteristic is not that they themselves constitute a movement, but that they repeatedly position themselves alongside other movements. And therefore, I think that they are better understood as allies. That is, groups that will facilitate, that will document, that will defend, connect, investigate. I mentioned fact finding, and amplify the claims that are being made by various segments of society. Actually, this is such a familiar feature of democratic politics that we have stopped noticing it. There's a very rich literature, if you see on the next slide, there's a very rich literature on protest movements, on state and civil society dynamic, and on legal activism. And in all this work, allies are mentioned as part of the different movement trajectories. But allies are not the... Even though they have been acting independently, they have been acting systematically. This is not about one person going to a movement cause that they support. This is a group collectively working independently for several decades now. But the movement literature is still kind of, I call it binary, which is that they talk about social movement politics as movement versus the state. And this was the gap that my book was trying to is seeking to address. There's also another reason why I think it's valuable to look at these groups. As I mentioned, the dominant narrative is a binary one, right? State versus the social movement. What happens then is you end up kind of making a monolith of both. But in fact, when it comes to a social movement, there's a whole ecology of actors. There are tensions between leader and cadre. There is presence of intermediaries. There are spokespersons. There are local adversaries, and of course, allies within what we consider a movement. So, not as a monolith, but as an ecology of several different actors. And again, there's remarkably little work asking what is the role that allies have played, how do they understand themselves, what kind of political practices they engage in, and how their political practices actually differ from those of the movements that they are supporting. Let me give you a couple of more examples of their conduct sort of historically. On the next slide, you'll see in 1973, the Calcutta-based APDR, Association for mobilizing of imprisoned Naxalite prisoners. Actually, female members of imprisoned Naxalite prisoner families. And they submitted a memorandum to the West Bengal government demanding recognition of political prisoners, demanding their release, demanding accountability for instances of custodial violence, demanding for bail, so on and so forth. Prisoner welfare. And in the book, I actually talk about how it is very interesting that the APDR acted independently, even though the CPI-ML itself, to which many of the prisoners belonged, was not seeking special status for political prisoners. Then across the 1980s, I have reports, organizational statements present within civil liberties activism that make a very deliberate, clear effort to support a wide range of marginalized groups. If you go to the next slide, it's a screenshot of...
Dr. Pandey, I'm so sorry for interrupting you in between. I think there's an internet issue because of which what happens is we lose you for a couple of seconds.
Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, so we wouldn't mind, because this is so interesting. If you were to switch off your video, we'll at least hear you clearly throughout the and just to help your internet a little bit. Yes.
Is okay. Let me know.
Yeah.
Please don't hesitate to interrupt, and let me know if this helps in the clarity of.
We'll do that right away.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And
Was-
now I'll move to the next slide, as you just said.
Thank you. I was saying that the next slide is a screenshot
Can you
of.
please start from the previous slide? So I didn't hear.
Yeah, this is the slide I'm talking
Yes,
about.
yes, that one.
The next one is a screenshot of People's Union for Democratic Rights, their web. If you go to the next one. Yes. Now here, I don't know if you can read it, but even when they are talking about themselves, this is from the About PUDR section of the website. They are making a deliberate sort of effort to support a wide range of marginalized groups. They mention workers, peasants, tribals, students, slum dwellers. So it was quite evident to me that these groups were quite consciously wanting to expand their work to forge solidarities across different sections of society. Even when I looked at some of the contemporaneous commentaries from the time, for example, A.R. Desai has 3 volumes on civil liberties activism. And in 1989, when he mentions about, it reproduces some of the fact-finding reports, etc. It's more a contemporary, collection, chronicle of this activism. And when he writes about them, he says that these are groups or individuals that have participated in the struggles of the oppressed and exploited sections of society. So even here, the description reinforces the idea that they were people who stood alongside existing movements and provided support. Then, of course, in the interviews that I conducted, amplifying the voices of groups that lacked visibility was something activists often mentioned. There's a former PUDR activist who explained that they would deliberately focus on smaller movements. They would focus on regional organizations and trade unions that otherwise lacked access to metropolitan media or lacked access to political networks in the national capital. So they would organize, what would these groups do? Civil liberties groups would organize legal defense committees, they would conduct fact-finding investigations, would issue public statements, convened people's tribunals, they raised funds for legal aid for prisoners, they produced newsletters, they documented custodial violence, they connected local struggles with national newspapers. If somebody knew somebody, they would want a story to be covered by one of the national newspapers. They sometimes organized public meetings for creating awareness. And across all this, the common purpose that stood out to me, something that was very clear to me, is that they were doing everything one needed to do to help claims travel. And I emphasize on this because I'm going to kind of work a little bit more and try and understand more about this business of how claims travel within the social movement landscape. So they are doing what they are doing to amplify and help claims travel from the local to the national to sometimes the international. They would take things to Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, so on and so forth. And this observation that I just made about amplification became one of the conceptual centers of the book. I began thinking about how allies engage in the politics of amplification. And by amplification, I mean like a conscious, organized effort which has been made by relatively privileged actors who are using their social position, who are using their professional expertise, organizational resources, and personal networks to increase the visibility as well as to bring legitimacy to struggles that are otherwise politically marginal. Now, at this point, let me talk a little bit about the history of these groups. On the next slide, you will see that there's a rich history of civil liberties activism in colonial India. I call it the prehistory, and I'll be, because in the interest of time, I will not talk about this a lot, but I just wanted to say that this activism emerges in very much as part of the anti-colonial movement. There are some very well-known inquiries like the Champaran inquiry, the Congress Punjab inquiry, which was conducted in the aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and there are some others as well. Also, the first civil liberties groups was established in 1936 around this time. But I'll move on to independent India, because that is when most of this sort of work is located. So on the next slide, you will see in independent India, this activism arises in the context of the Naxalite movement, or more specifically, the counterinsurgency operations against the Naxalite movement, as well as the imposition of the internal emergency in 1975. So groups like the APDR are established in Calcutta in 1972. The APCLC is established in Andhra in 1974. I must say that Andhra has a very rich history of civil liberties activism, which, not knowing the language, is difficult for me to access. So I have mostly concentrated on North India and the Bengal, where I can access the language a little bit. Ease. The members of these groups, right from the beginning, have been urban, educated, mostly middle class, salary professionals, so doctors, lawyers, journalists, academics. And at that time, they were sympathizers of the causes that led to the Naxalite movement, but not members of the movement itself, may even disagree with the strategies and tactics of the movement. They were protesting at that time police abuse, detentions and tortures of Naxalite prisoners, and later the first national All India Civil Liberties Group was set up in 1976 by Jayaprakash Narayan and B.M. Tarkunde and many others, and it was called the PUCLDR. In the 1980s, to just sort of cut the long story short, in the 1980s, a split emerges and two groups, the PUCL and the PUDR, are formed, which continue to be the national sort of civil liberties groups. And they continue to also work independently. They also work in close coordination, and often they conduct fact findings together. Often they work under the same umbrella platforms. Now, I noticed that Kolkata and Delhi were emerging as two centers that I could access. And so I visited these two to meet activists in these two cities. In Kolkata, many of the activists I interviewed had, of course, seen counterinsurgency operations up close in the aftermath of the Naxalite movement. In a way that Delhi, as an urban center, national capital, that kind of a crackdown yet. So what struck me there was the language that several of them were using to describe civil liberties activism. They repeatedly referred to its inception as a tactical move, which I thought was a revealing expression. They were telling me that civil liberties activism is a pragmatic effort, and many of them, would kind of reinforce this idea. I thought this was a pragmatic effort to secure some immediate relief for political prisoners and we wanted to expose custodial violence while continuing to hold on to an overall political critique of state power. They reported significant trust deficit in the state. And in contrast, when I met people in Delhi, you can see the next slide as well as the slide after that. In contrast, when I met people in Delhi, their formative political experience was the imposition of the emergency, as well as the broader crisis of democratic institutions in their perception in the mid-1970s. Delhi, the Citizens appears in 1974, followed by the PUCLDR in 1976. And these organizations bring together quite a broad ideological coalition, right? So there are Gandhians, there are left and socialist intellectuals, there are liberals, all of whom are concerned about the erosion of constitutional freedoms. And which I found this very interesting. Most of the activists in Kolkata reported that they are starting from a position of trust deficit. trust had once reposed in the state. Now, of course, I want to clarify here that I'm not suggesting that Delhi people think one way and Calcutta people think one way. I'm not trying to say that people of one city think alike. What it revealed to me is two political tendencies that eventually have converged to shape civil liberties activism nationally. And it kind of reveals to me that the practice of allyship is at once deeply critical of state power and yet consistently willing to engage with the government, legal institutions, court, and constitutional remedies. And this kind of, tension, as well as what you may see, what may seem as a paradox, you will see this later also when we talk about the practice of fact finding. A second theme that also emerged in the interviews that I had conducted in both these cities is many activists described experiencing some profound sense of responsibility associated with being privileged or being members of the educated middle class. They were clearly part of a wider intellectual culture in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, where teachers, lawyers, writers, academics were being repeatedly called upon quite publicly to assume responsibility in the nation's political activists who described intellectuals as mediators between movements and the state. And that made me argue that civil liberties activism is clearly emerging through the convergence of a couple of longer historical currents. On slide 21, I think the next one, I have tried to kind of have a graphic description of the forces that I think came together to produce allyship. One, it draws from like I just mentioned, it draws from a collectively held idea of what one's civic role is. And the word collective here is important. This is not thinking that they have a certain role to play. Secondly, there has been present a very long and strong skepticism of state power and a deeply ingrained commitment to the idea of liberty that is present not only among Indian liberals, but also Congress socialists and also heterodox strands within the Indian left. So a very wide variety of left seem to be very committed to the idea of liberty. And C.A. Bailey also talks about this. As you know, these are the groups, the Congress, the Indian liberals, these are the groups that form primary opposition in the first 3 decades following independence. So it's no surprise that they are actually finding themselves in the civil society domain, mobilizing against violence, or mobilizing against abuse of power by the state. Thirdly, of course, allyship is also enabled by post-colonial Indian constitutional and legal culture, which kind of views engagement with the court and constitutional institutions as valuable, tactically valuable, even if activists remain very skeptical of state power. So having and how this activism emerged, the next thing that the book does is to try and understand what kind of practices they adopted and also what kind of political actors they are. So to do this, I'll just talk very briefly about the themes of 2 chapters. One is on fact-finding and one is on their self-identification and how they understood their own political role. The next slide, you see a bunch of fact-finding reports, as well as one where the fact-finding report is meeting press. Fact-finding has been one of the most consistent and frequently adopted practice of civil liberties groups. PUDR, PUCL have conducted hundreds of such investigations. And to me, it is surprising that there are scholars who have even relied on their reports, but very little attention has been paid to fact-finding as a political practice in its own right. And my interest, of course, is not in the findings of particular reports, but in the practice itself. Now, one of the things that the fact-finding chapter does is it traces a much longer genealogy of independent citizens as fact-finding than is usually recognized. It talks about the Congress inquiries, in colonial India. And it talks about how civil liberties groups of 1970s inherited and adapted this repertoire to the post-colonial context. And in the chapter, I look at some of the early fact-finding reports from 70s and 80s, and I make the argument that there are three defining features of this practice. I'll simply just mention them and not kind of talk about them in any detail. One is fact-finding as a practice kind of raises people's they'll go to the field, transform memories and oral accounts into legally admissible testimony. Teams will systematically record, verify, corroborate, read out back to the person who's giving the testimony, document it. All this in a way that it could subsequently be used before a court in a public interest litigation or to a commission of inquiry. Secondly, there was a lot of emphasis on re-narrating the event. The official records were very depersonalized. Encounter happened, there was a police firing, there was an extremist killed, anti-national element or anti-social activity. But fact-finding reports will reconstruct with a lot of labor the entire context. Perspectives, give the perspectives of those who are affected. So it became a way of challenging official narrative through alternative narrative. And the third was, of course, to expose official cover-ups. The teams would identify inconsistencies in police records, in administrative accounts, in classifications, etc. And the larger argument of the chapter on fact-finding is to point to the unique ideological position that fact-finding has. It simultaneously imitates as well as it opposes the juridical order. It borrows the procedure, it borrows evidentiary standards, documentary conventions of constitutional activism and liberal legalism. But it is being undertaken, at least in this period, largely on behalf of left movements that are very skeptical of the state and in some cases very skeptical of the bourgeois law itself. Therefore, I call fact-finding as a form of left legalism, a hybrid political practice that navigates two otherwise opposed worlds. And its significance, I argue, actually lies precisely in this amphibian quality. It belongs both to liberal constitutionalism as well as radical politics, while being reduced to neither. And let me now come very quickly to how they articulate their own political identity. Again and again, activists describe themselves as concerned citizens. They would sign off documents as concerned citizens. They would write reports, press releases as concerned citizens. They would sign letters as concerned citizens. And the more I encountered it, the more I realized that it was doing considerable political work in the context of allyship. It was a political that legitimized intervention in struggles that one does not otherwise directly inhabit. Like, it's not my struggle. How do I actually become a member of this struggle quite legitimately? So it becomes a very suitable civic expression for allyship. You all know I don't need to talk about the fact that there are many studies of citizenship that actually focus on legal status or on how ordinary people understand citizenship claims. But I wanted to look at how those who voluntarily enter struggles, because they believe that the struggle concerns the democratic community as a whole. So they are making the argument that part of being concerned citizen is to monitor state power, to defend constitutional freedoms, to support vulnerable groups. All this is an obligation of citizenship itself, which I think is a very interesting articulation of the idea of citizenship. And I have already said before, this self-identification is also solving a political problem, because allies lack the experiential authority that people who are directly affected have. So concerned citizenship provides them with another basis for legitimacy. It allows them to say, I intervene because this concerns the democratic community of which I am also a member. So now, in the time that I have left, I just want to conclude by returning to the big picture. Please come to the next slide, and my final slide. Just a few remarks about the big picture and the analytical bits that it allows us to think of. First, this activism, of course, allows us to see the politics of amplification. Which people help make someone else's struggle more visible, more audible, more difficult to ignore. And I said normative because amplification should be different from speaking on behalf of someone. Instead, it should be about creating conditions in which people can be heard by the wider audience. And one reason amplification matters is, we have known that protests often will reach a point where the protesting group will eventually encounter state institutions. And state institutions can either ignore it or respond to it. And at this point, allies become very important. Sometimes change will happen because there is who is willing to hear a case, there is a journalist who is willing to publish a difficult story, or there's a lawyer who's willing to take on some politically sensitive client, or there is a bureaucrat who is willing to leak or release information, or there is a teacher who is willing to organize some public discussion about something. Now, all of these people they don't belong to the movement. But what they do is they create openings through which movement demands can actually travel. And this idea, I think at least, that it helps us enter a couple of important debates in political science. Think of the whole subaltern studies project and the question of voice, the question of representation, the question of how do the marginalized express their political agency. Now, many of you will know that the most well-known intervention on this sort of wider question is Partha Chatterjee's distinction between civil and political society. He's making the argument that many marginalized groups may not speak in the formal language of citizenship, but they nevertheless act through protest, negotiation, occupation, everyday practices. My book is trying to show that this search to categorize domains of political activity actually overlooks the relationships that are forged between members of what Chatterjee calls civil society and what he calls political society, or those that are outside of its bounds. So it highlights the people and the practices that actually mediate these two domains. There is a connective tissue that binds these ostensibly separate domains into a larger ecology of resistance. And so the politics of amplification enters this debate from that slightly different angle. It's not asking who is speaking, it's asking how are voices traveling. It's focusing on intermediaries who connect local struggles to wider publics. So one way of thinking about allies is to see them as constituting part of a democratic infrastructure of society. And I really mean I use the word infrastructure quite consciously. Much like infrastructure in a physical sense, like road, building, bridges, they actually build a network of intermediary institutions, practices, relationships that will enable claims to travel from margins to the center of political public life. And because these are different political practices, of course, they generate different concerns. Just to quickly say in the politics of representation, what is our worry? Our worry is, will the voice get appropriated? Will the voice get erased, as Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak had said? The politics of amplification worries about tokenism or selective amplification or unequal distribution of visibility. Those become the questions become who is receiving the attention, which struggles are becoming national issues, which movements are gaining allies and which are remaining unheard. Like once we open up this field, then we can ask these kinds of questions. And while the idea of representation is very widely discussed in political theory, amplification much less so. There are allyship, media studies, algorithmic amplification, some scholarship on agenda setting and journalism. But I think the concept offers us a very useful way of thinking about the role of intermediaries in democratic politics and help us understand how movements acquire visibility, legitimacy, and political influence without reducing it to just representation alone. And I want to end by saying that these actors have actually always existed. What I have tried to do in becoming allies is to come up with a conceptual language to understand the political work that they have performed I've tried to switch my video on. Let me know if the voice gets.
Yeah.
No, it's
And if you could repeat the last two sentences,
yeah.
just the last two.
Oh, is that? Oh, I'm so sorry. I was saying that I don't know. I was saying that that allies as actors have always existed. What I'm trying to do in the book is to come up with a conceptual language to understand the kind of political work that they have been performing for a very long time. Yeah, I think that's what I said. And did you hear the bit on the little bit of literature on amplification?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Spivak and all, yes. Yes.
Okay, so my turn to switch my video on. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey, for that very interesting presentation. And in fact, it solves. I was thinking solves a lot of questions that, and borrowing from you, the normative questions about who can represent whom, and more on that because we have two discussants here who've read the book intimately and engaged with it, and they would want to present some of their thoughts and probably also ask you some difficult questions if they may. Let me introduce Dr. Sanjukta Nath and Suhasini Guptu. Sanjukta works in international relations. Her PhD work deals with gendered violence, but in her case, she's looking at men as victims of gendered violence in war. And we know Suhasini, whose very interesting paper has appeared in EPW recently on political theory, and she has an MPhil in political theory, and she's now a PhD candidate at Presidency University, where she's also dealing with these questions. Sanjukta is teaching at Indraprasth Law School at Delhi, and both of them today would be our discussants. So, as the format goes, you have very few minutes, 4 minutes each to make a presentation or speak about your thoughts, and then you could raise questions. Once our discussants have spoken, we'll open the floor for questions. Meanwhile, our participants can actually type out their questions in the chat box. If you want to ask a question, you could always unmute yourself and ask right away. But we'll give time to our discussants first. So Hasini, Sanjukta, how would you?
Just a quick bit. We can stop screen sharing the presentation.
Absolutely. But because I am right now the master of all and the jack of all and the master of none. So after I've done introducing the two of them, I'm going to go back to stopping the screen share. So on that note, maybe we could start with Sanjukta. Dr. Nath, do you feel comfortable going first? All right.
Yeah.
So we add you in the pin and then we go and stop the screen share.
So I can start, right? I think.
Yes, please,
Yeah.
please.
Thank you so much for this. Was such a, I think, even though there were slight glitches, I think you laid out the whole book, and the book has so much material. Every chapter feels like one separate research paper, is it? Like you can have other story. Every chapter has its own story. So I think I should start where Jigyasa also started with. Where do you, when we make distinction between amplification and representation in the book we did, right? But isn't it the same binary? Whose voice are we going to talk about? Whose voice are being selected to be amplified? And even in your cases, when you've looked at maybe Hyderabad, big cities, what about the small places, small struggles of places? There was a slight ideas on Assam, Northeast. I think, how do you amplify, and whose claim are we talking about? Well, I think that is one question which even I thought when I was looking at the book, I was like, fine, because I also am from Assam, and then Assam has also a sort of history of different kind of social movements, different types of indigenous movements also. So where do we see amplification working here? One. And do you want me to like have a question or one by one? I don't, however it helps.
We can have your presentation first. If you have questions, then maybe putting all of them out
All
together
the
would be good.
Great. ठीक है. I think I have more or less around 3 questions. One was also, how does the whole politics of amplification, which whom do we whose voice gets heard. Second, my question was also on the methods of the whole study. Since your study is also located in the 70s, 80s, it's ends somewhere, at least the book. And then somewhere you also talk about BK16 and all. And then the pamphlet and the interviews. You also mention memory. Memory might not be as strong. And how does it work? Even when when in maybe the work of oral narrative, how does then as a researcher we find ourselves how what to include, what not to include, how do we then try to be as objective? So maybe somewhere how does the whole method research in this ground level research worked for you in this book? And third would be also, do you see somewhere that when we start or the book starts saying that the allies do not have any stake, right? So they are coming, they do not, it's not the issue, but they're coming for, it's to represent other issues and all. But what, given this day and time when we talk about the allies or the civil liberty activists who also after a point are surveilled, maybe they are arrested, or they do you think do they also get or attain some kind of stake in the whole conversation of civil liberties? So once, if so, then does they still remain allies, or we call them something else? Like, how does it work? If
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjukta. We'll go to Suhasini now, and then we'll circle back to Dr. Pandey for her response in these two presentations. Suhasini,
Yes.
yes.
Thank you so much. Right off the bat, I really want to congratulate the author for writing a very lucid book on a very complex theme. I think when we were discussing reading this book in our reading group, we all observed that though you have covered such a vast terrain of facts, knowledge, social actors, one of the dangers of academic writing is that it makes this knowledge inaccessible. But that is not a pitfall in this book. You can read each chapter not only as a research paper in itself, but also you're very good at linking each chapter with one another. So I really wanted to congratulate you on that because it makes the process of reading joyful. And I think that's what we go for when we're writing a book. I have 5 clusters of intervention. Some of them overlap with Sanjuktadi's, so I'm not going to repeat them. I will first be talking about politics and ethics. Second, the question of depoliticization. Third, political apathy. Fourth, the question of framing, which you mentioned in the book, but you didn't bring up today. So I'm going to take the liberty to bring it up right now. And finally, on the question of political affect, which is me trying to bring Jigyasa into this conversation. Okay. So the first point is, I think one argument that is running throughout this book, and you don't make it explicitly, but that was my observation, was a question of politics and ethics. Now, traditionally, politics and ethics are seen as opposed to one another. Since the famous Machiavellian rupture, the state it makes it very clear that the set of ethics that rules the domain of politics cannot be confused with morality in everyday life. But I think what politics of amplification does very well is that it serves as the conduit, which acts as a bridge between individual ethical concerns and the desire for structural change, which is associated at the political level. So this, I think, is a very interesting argument that comes out of your research and your excellent ethnographic work, because it raises a central question, which is whether in the neoliberal era, this traditional distinction between individual ethics and politics is tenable at all. Because increasingly we see that politics is being atomized at the individual level. I mean, Wendy Brown, etc. A lot of people have talked about this. And this is seen as and this leads up to my second theme, which is about depoliticization, is that this is seen as a cause of concern because people are no longer attached to one another. They don't see each other as a collective. But I think what politics of amplification brings out, and especially the concept of allyship brings out, is that can democracy, instead of being thought of as a set of rules, institutions, and practices, be recrafted entirely in terms of an ethical orientation, where allyship becomes part of a larger democratic political ethics? And I think you were talking about this in the last slide, where you were talking about the infrastructure that you're referring to. So when we talk about democracy and challenges to democracy, we usually talk about institutional failure or challenges to institutions. I think it's really interesting in looking at the ethical aspect to it, which has come out really well in this case study that you have brought up. So, I mean, I think that's something I would like to hear more about. But the problem with allyship and democracy that I feel comes up is the question of what Sanjukta Di also raised, and I call it the issue of authenticity. Whenever there is a process of amplification, there is necessarily a process of selection that takes place. What is amplified and what is not. Now, in that case, there remains a problem where there can be a systematic prioritization of some demands over others, which can lead to the loss of authentic voice, especially when we're talking about marginalized sections of society. And one category of people I remain wary of is political parasites in a certain way, who take up these issues and then essentially co-opt the narrative in a certain way to numb their sharpness, or even use a political movement for their own political benefit in the sense of getting legislative seats, or we are aware of the way politicians work. Another example I was thinking of was something like pink capitalism, where you have corporations saying we are allies of social movements. But essentially, that allyship, in the name of positing an ethical position, becomes a way of increasing your own profits, right? Which lasts for 1 month and then immediately it disappears. So, in that context, given the fact that allyship can sometimes become superficial, the question I have is, what happens when amplification leads to selective silencing, and how can this be avoided? The second point, leading from the first question, is the question of depoliticization. And I think the book is at its most theoretically sophisticated when it's dealing with the question of civil society and political society, which every political science student studies, I think, from the first year. And I really like the way that you challenge this using the concept of amplification. And I really like the phrase which you use, which is amphibian-like position. And one of the concepts that runs throughout the book is the fact that the fluidity that civil liberties organizations have is the kind of exclusive benefit they provide to social movements. They can be a part of the civil society as well as political society. The problem I have with this, and one of the problems I think that might come up, is that civil society politics has its own grammar. But political society politics has its own way of negotiation, right? Uh, what happens when these two separate grammars of politics come in conflict with one another? There is obviously a possibility of mediation, but again, I go back to the first point, where in this mediation, is there a possibility of elite capture where certain groups will prevail over others? So, given the fact that we need to understand how political society and civil society works with each other, how can we analyze instances of conflict between the grammars of politics espoused by each? The third point which I wanted to raise, which is on political apathy. Now, when I was reading this as someone who's unfortunately a Gen Z person, we are quite hated right now. But one of the things that I felt was that a lot of passion that arose in these civil liberties groups was a kind of failure of promise in the Nehruvian era, right? Like, there was a lot of promise in this period that the constitution guaranteed certain liberties, certain expectations, which were not met by the post-colonial state. And that justifiably led to this feeling of disillusionment, which led to allyship as a distinct form of political action developing. I was curious to, I was wondering, what do you think about the current day and age, where I would say like the dominant mode of feeling is political apathy. People are very apathetic towards politics. You do use the term stakeholder multiple times in your book. So I was thinking that what happens when you just don't feel like you're a stakeholder anymore? And it's again linking it with neoliberalism, where you're constantly atomized into a singular person in a unconnected society. So how does allyship function in the context of political apathy? The fourth point I wanted to ask you about, and I think this is a really interesting concept which you use, I think I'm forgetting which chapter it is, it's page 112, which is where you talk about framing and how the framing done by civil liberty activists is very crucial to how these movements were perceived. And you say that activist groups explain their actions, produce an interpretative scheme, highlight specific issues, and ignore others. And this is different from ideology, as it is more readily empirically observable. So I think this is a very interesting point, as how framing of the issues which were raised by marginalized groups, how that translates into social or political change. So I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about that. Uh, the last point is on political affect. And like I said, this is not my area. This is absolutely Jigyasa, and she will be able to explain it much better. But this was again my observation, which was that scattered across specifically chapter 1 is the prevalence of terms like suspicion, faith, guilt, frustration. And I was wondering that whether the interviews that you conducted could be analyzed as a larger story about emotions and democracy, like how emotions can play a part in maintaining democracy, like an emotional connection to having democratic ethics both at the individual level and the societal level can be used to hold power accountable in a certain way. And obviously, over here, I am fully thinking about Gopal Guru's work on humiliation and how the embodied feeling of humiliation is conceptualized and can be used to explain social reality. So I was wondering whether the embodied experience of guilt, frustration, and other feelings that you mentioned could be used to tell us more about the social reality of that era, and tracing emotions as an alternative source to understand material reality and explain it or make it or make more apparent certain contradictions which are not evident in other sources. So these were my 5 points, and the last is my gripe with you, which is on page, I marked it out on page, this is the political theorist in me. So on page 6 you say, it is not my intention to define allyship as a deterministic concept or to draw rigid boundaries between ally activism and other forms of activism. My question is why? I think, given the rich body of material you have, you can absolutely come up with allyship as a deterministic concept. And I think that will be very helpful for political science research at large. And also, it will probably answer all the questions that I have posed to you today. But at the same time, I also have a sense of why you might not want to do it, because in the next line, you do clarify that, saying that not every group uniformly adopts the same self-perception. But once again, this is like me as someone who prefers abstraction over historical studies. I want to know, why didn't you come up with a deterministic concept of allyship? So yes, that's all. Thank you so much, and looking forward to hearing your response.
Thank you both of you, Dr. Nath and Suhasini, Dr. Sanjukta and Suhasini. We will now, because I mean, at the top of my head, I can think of 7 things that they've already said, and those are. I'm sure they're not. Wouldn't be difficult for you because you worked on the book, but these are 7 themes right away. So we'll give Dr. Pandey the time to respond to these. Meanwhile, please feel free to type your questions out, frame them in your head, and we'll come to the participants once Dr. Pandey has responded to these. Thank you. To you, Dr. Pandey.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Are you able to see me and hear me? Because the video is on. Okay, good. That's good. Let me know if it sort of hangs or there's a problem. Thank you so much. Wonderful, super intelligent questions that are excellent questions that are at the heart of what the book tries to argue. Now, I've written them down, so I'm going to go in the reverse order and give a very, so Hasini, give a very sort of short reply to the last two that you asked and speak about the others a little bit in greater detail. The claim not being deterministic, that bit about the practice of ally activism is because, I was one of the things I wrestle with in the book, quite honestly, is the slippage between the activist and the activism. Now, so while at the level of practice, and I think that I struggled with it even when I was writing the book, even when I was working as a when it was my doctoral project, there was always a sort of a dilemma in me about whether this is about activists or is it about activism, the practice. And I, of course, have kind of chose the latter, the practice itself. Level, but it's really difficult to separate the two. So at the level, I would say that at the level of the practice, maybe yes, we can make a very deterministic claim about what it is. But at the level of people and the fact that they move between different domains and different phases of their life, you saw one image of retired high court judges sitting in a people's tribunal. So because people move in and out of things at that level, at the level of actors, it is very difficult to make a deterministic sort of argument about someone being ally and not something else. But at the level of practice, I fully agree that one can definitely clearly identify an ally practice as opposed to many. Also, a sort of a small answer to the emotions, the guilt, the sort of, empathy, all of that. Actually, the work that does exist on allyship in Western and particularly European context does in fact talk about emotions. So there is a lot of work on in the context of the Holocaust, people who supported the victims of Holocaust and how that went. There is also work in the context of the American civil rights movement about white people supporting the African American. Very much about how is it that some people have greater empathy. There are studies in sort of political sociology domain, studies that look at generational empathy being empathy arising out of a context of knowing of familiarity and things of that sort. I felt, and this was just perhaps a intellectual call, I felt I wanted to look at a larger sort of structure, like a political culture that a set of people inhabit. Because also in my case, I wasn't looking at individual acts of solidarity. Like I mentioned before, it's not me going to Jantar Mantar to stand with in solidarity. Part of an organization that, because of various ideological traditions, I am a Gandhian, I believe in the idea of service. I am a revolutionary lefty who believes in some version of the vanguard, idea. Or I am a liberal who is deeply concerned with the excesses of the state. So I felt it was more true to the field to talk about the ideological sort of inheritance of this group of people in the 70s and 80s in a way that has ceased to exist today. So I also agree with your sort of bit about apathy, but that I will not engage with a little bit more. I have not spent as much time thinking about allyship today, but that's something I kind of take back with me to think about. Because I mean, of late I have been thinking about digital liberties activism and groups like the Internet Freedom Foundation, and can they be thought about as ally platforms? But that is something that needs greater sort of work. But the ideology bit, this distinction between ideology and framing that you spoke about, that of course is very central to the empirical findings. I would say that while ideology is this sort of I mentioned Gandhian, socialist, liberal, Marxist, revolutionary. the ideological commitments matter, but they are not the force that is determining how civil liberties groups are responding to particular events. Now, who they are as an organization and what their identity will be and what positions they take, that is being worked out through repeated acts of framing. So every difficult issue that emerges, the meaning of democratic rights, can we support revolutionary violence? So do we have to condemn, should we go out and condemn revolutionary violence? The previous speaker, but even other things, there was a Nagbhushan Patnaik case that book talks about. In each, the civil liberties groups have to decide, how do we understand this issue? How do we take a position on this issue? Whose rights are we going to stand, especially when there are rights of two groups that clash? Should we intervene at all? If so, on what ground do we intervene? What is the principle on which we intervene? These to me are framing sort of issues. How do you actually, how you deliberate, you negotiate, and you come up with a frame that is politically defensible and that is ethically also defensible.
Just one thing,
Human
I
groups.
think you need
We-
to stop your video because you're breaking beach mein. So yeah,
Thank-
yeah.
Thank you
I
for
mean,
thank you for alerting me.
yes.
Thank you for alerting me to that. So I was saying that I think all movement groups wrestle with the question of ideology, and it's quite important that we observe them, we talk about them, because as I mentioned before, it's not the case that groups are just applying some existing ideology to situations. They are continually sort of defining, negotiating how they must present themselves. So that's the bit. So ideology and framing. You mentioned about the civil and political society having a different grammar and the risk of elite capture. And I think that this risk of elite capture and how they are deciding was brought up 3 or 4 times. I just want to say that I entirely agree. This is a risk that doing this politics, it comes with the terrain of doing this politics. So it's a very legitimate concern. It is a concern that not just we as observers of movement politics have, but groups that are being represented, of course, have that. People that they are, the causes that they are amplifying, movement groups make demands of them. There isn't sort of a dynamic relationship between who they are amplifying and how they are amplifying. So this is a challenge that allyship has to confront. Just like all the risks that the idea of representation carries. What if you end up erasing? What if you end up substituting? And I am so glad that all of you are asking these questions, because unless we actually identify this as a separate practice, how are we going to ask these questions? So to me, what the book does is to open up that terrain. Let's identify all the different actors within an ecology. Let's see what they are doing. Then we can begin to ask questions of them and trying to even hold them accountable. But we were in a situation where we are mostly thinking of these groups as part of the movement itself. So then this layered tension that exists, we are not able to actually academically, of course, it gets called out in the movement all the time, but academically, not talking about it. So that's the risk of elite capture. I completely agree. It's very true, and there has to be vigilance by those who are studying it to see how this risk actually pans out. So the book doesn't deny that risk. The book opens up a field so that this risk and this tension can actually be made legible. I would say the political society, civil society having different grammar bit. Now, of course, civil society, that's actually also a risk. Civil society speaks in the language of rights and legality and constitutionalism. And so it's true that when allies enter these struggles or even carry the claims, there is a risk that they will translate these claims into a language that they are most comfortable with. And so that there is therefore also a risk of elite capture there. The point is that I feel that democratic politics also cannot function without intermediaries. Intermediaries, though, that are these domains, so it's both things, right? It creates possibilities, democratic possibilities. It also creates democratic dangers. So it is enabling the claims to travel. It's also creating the possibility of distortion. And in that sense, the legitimacy of sort of allyship will only improve if it becomes accountable to the struggles that they are seeking to support. And that, I mean, on an academic note, I can say that this tension is constitutive. This tension is not something that is a misapplication of the practice. This tension will remain. It's a very productive tension that should remain when we are thinking of allyship. The question on, I feel like this also kind of addresses the bit about authenticity and the risk of slippage. Like I said, the legitimacy of them will depend on whether they are expanding democratic space or they are just occupying that space themselves, becoming the center of attention, and cannot permanently resolved. Authenticity can never be guaranteed. It will need to be negotiated. So you are right. Allies will possess greater access to law, to media, to universities. They carry a lot of credibility from the communities that they support. So yeah, they could set agenda. They could decide which struggles deserve attention. And in authenticity, absolutely, it's never guaranteed. But I must also say one bit. In the interviews that I conducted, activists were aware of these dangers. They did talk about, they said that internally we are always debating organizational autonomy, we are debating representation, we are determining the limits of intervention, we are debating, okay, we will make a report and publish the names of people who are guilty, but will that mean that there's going to be a backlash on the people that we are representing? So there is all that tension that they described being aware of. Then there is the question of the opposition between ethics and politics. Now, you see, I can only answer this empirically. The activists I interview often describe their work not as a strategic thing, not as an instrumental thing, but a deep ethical obligation. There's one of them who I started as a Maoist and now I have become Gandhian. And he says that once you start, you can never say oppression, or you can never say that injustice done to me is wrong. You'll always have to say injustice is wrong. So the idea that the moment you start doing civil liberties activism, it will abstract itself at the level of the principle. You can't say custodial torture to my friend is wrong. You can't say, encounter of my comrade is incorrect. You'll have to say encounter as a practice is unethical. So that bit, they were very aware of the fact that there is an ethical obligation arising from their own understanding of democracy, from their understanding of what is their responsibility. And he said, the person I'm talking about, he mentions that civil liberties activism is not a question of tactic, it's a question of ethics. So, which captures this transformation that, at least to them, I can assure you, they are not thinking of ethics as an alternative to politics or as opposed to politics. They are thinking that their ethics actually shapes the kind of politics that they are practicing. And because I'm saying all of this, I want to say that I want to caution against romanticizing any of this. Like, I don't want to, this is not to say that ethical commitments make them some superior beings or that it eliminated, political disagreement. Ethics, and in that sense, I mean it more as something that informs their political judgment, not as something that is morally necessarily superior. I think that's sort of all of Suhasini's questions. There was a previous question on I claiming that allies don't have a direct stake, but the case. So we'll have to kind of think about what we mean by stake. The book is making the argument that allies generally do not have a direct experiential stake in the specific injustices that they are responding to. But they, of course, have a political and a moral stake. So therefore, I use the word direct and experiential, that they are not going to benefit directly or experientially from but do they have in terms of principle, in terms of ethics and morality? Yes, of course, they have a stake. They believe that erosion of civil liberties is ultimately have developed emotional investment in the struggles they support. They have, of course, not to mention the organizational investment in the struggles they support. So the distinction is not about having a stake and having no stake. It's more about whether you have a direct stake in the grievance or an indirect stake in the health of a democratic society. And that's how I mean the direct stake bit. Methodology, I can say so much about it. So very interesting to do the interviews, and because talking to people who are in their 80s, 70s or 80s. So it's also very interesting to talk about how people will revisit their youth when they are talking, what they talk about, what they think is worth remembering is super interesting. I have conducted about 100 or 120 sort of long semi-structured interviews with activists across. I went to Calcutta, I went to Delhi, of course, I went to Goa. Now, this is the other thing, that people who are active in the 1970s and 80s in Delhi have retired everywhere else in the country. Now, this is not that they are found in Delhi. Moved to Hyderabad, someone moved to Bombay, so I'm following them wherever they've gone and settled down after their retirement, very often back to where they had come from. So just because in the 80s they were in Delhi, there's no reason to think that they are in Delhi in 2020 or 2025. And I was very interested in how they remembered and interpreted their own political journey. So I was asking them to, talk about their memory of the activism, try to make sense of their political life. And I would kind of read it alongside. They were so generous. Many of them have shared fact-finding reports with me, newsletters with me. With their photographs from their private collections. The Calcutta photograph you saw is given to me by one of the activists. I just want to say that one thing that is interesting that occurs to me just now is many of them are very, very reluctant to speak about themselves. Why are you talking about us? Why don't you write about the organization? Why don't you join the organization? Why don't you, your time is better spent translating our reports and, helping us generate more awareness. Like, why focus on us? There's a lot of this collective ethic of self-effacement that I found, alongside a lot of questions. Enough. So, and I write that in the introduction. What do you know about our group? Do you, have you heard of this group? What do you know about emergency? So there's a lot of kind of, because these are political actors, they were checking to see the sincerity of my own interest in the subject. So they consistently were shifting attention towards the movement or towards the group that they had supported, and being very reluctant to talk about themselves. And as you see in the book, this reluctance itself becomes a very important finding. It reveals to me own role. In fact, many of the fact-finding reports are unauthored. Like I mentioned, they'll just say concerned citizens. It doesn't even tell you who are the people that went, which was very frustrating at the time because I was hoping to find the names and chase them for interviews. So that. Now, the first question, how did activists decide which claims were to be amplified? They told me that they were drawn to struggles that lacked visibility. They told me that they were drawn to struggles that wanted to access metropolitan and groups that lacked the organizational resources to do it. Of course, there is a moral judgment about which groups they align with. There is a question of political analysis. There is a question of strategic considerations about where it is that they can make the greatest difference. Just because they can ally, that's not enough. They're also thinking in terms of, can we be impactful if we ally with this particular struggle or that particular struggle? And at some point, one of them did mention that, if we are going to talk about detention as incorrect or preventive detention as unethical or unfair, or we want to oppose preventive detention, then we can't just oppose preventive detention for our comrades or progressive causes. We'll have to oppose preventive detention for all ideologies of people. So even if it is a group that we politically disagree with, they are protesting and they have been arrested, we'll have to come up with a statement. So again, I want to emphasize that this bit is being continuously negotiated and debated consistently across. I'll stop there and wait for more questions.
Thank you so much. I think there's already one question in the chat box. Swasni, will you read it out?
I'm reading it out. Give me a second.
Yeah.
Give me a second. Thank you so much for answering those questions. I had someone on the door, so I took some time. We have another question. I also have some input, but let's handle the questions first. Sakshi Wadhwa says, thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. It was an interesting, comprehensive session. I wanted to ask the following questions. Could you please elaborate on the distinction between mediation and allyship? Can mediators really be called allies, given that they occupy an intermediary position between members of political society and the state, rather than acting solely in solidarity with the groups they support? Further, based on your research, do you see possibilities for dialogue between social movements and state actors to become genuinely successful through such intermediaries? For instance, the Shaheen Bagh case appears to illustrate the limitations of mediation, with the Supreme Court appointed interlocutors ultimately failing to produce a negotiated resolution. Would you see this as a limitation of mediation itself, or was it specific to the political context of that case?
Okay. I'm going to, again, the much like Swasini's question, the one on the second bit, the one on contemporary times and the Shaheen Bagh, I'm going to take back and think about before responding. But on the previous bit, mediation and allyship, I would imagine mediation and allyship are really very different from each other. Mediation merely talks about, like, I actually think that mediation by definition is not. A mediator is facilitating communication. And a mediation can also be official, formal, like the state appoints, the court appoints mediators. So that function is about communication, translation, negotiation between two separate actors. The concept itself, mediation itself, is neutral. It's not telling us why the mediator is involved. It could be just their profession. It also tells us nothing about the ultimate interest that they are serving. But allyship is not like that. Allyship is taking a position. It's a I stand in solidarity with this. So allies are not just connecting actors. They are consciously aligning themselves with one group, marginalized group, And they are retaining they're one step removed. They are retaining their own autonomy, and they are making both a normative as well as a political intervention. So yeah, so I would say that allyship is a relationship. Mediation is a function. It's like a role that groups might play.
Do we have, Sakshi says, thank you, got it now. Do we have any other questions? You could unmute yourself and ask that question. You could type it out, although we've far exceeded the time of the Baithak already. But if there are questions, please. I will ask two questions actually. And your answers to the previous discussions has already handled much of what I had to say. So let me also go by congratulating you for two things. I like the fact that the book is we've almost read all these movements, spoke about them, heard about them, and participated in them in our time spaces as these small islands in the larger small islands actually, small conversations or momentous civil society activism of the time. And perhaps there have also been historical studies which have looked at the evolution of it and from the politics of the 60s and the 70s and the politics after 80s and then the new politics that we have now. What I really find interesting, and it's fascinating the way it's done, is the larger sheer canvas that you've drawn together. And in that sense, to get, if I may say, get these different movements to be in a dialogue with each other. And then I think you're taking another step backwards. It's of course it's a bird eye view conversation, but you're also taking a step back and you're saying, okay, what is the reason? Why are they doing what they're doing? As opposed to, oh, this happened and then how it acted and so on and so forth. So I think that just at the level of the vision that this work deserves congratulations at the scale and at the vision, the imagination of a large canvas for us to then look at this particular category within if I could think of politics as a system within which this one entity, this one set, how is that set interacting across time? So many congratulations on that, and I really found that fascinating and very interesting framing taking from you. Then I would come to the I'll connect what Suhasini said about political apathy and allyship. Now, while we do think in terms of apathy, and Suhasini goes ahead and says that there's a self-deprecatory remark there that Gen Z is the most hated. I would say Gen Z is not probably the most, they're not hated, they're just being understood in terms of the new way in which this generation is responding to its, to the politics or to the space that they've inherited. I was wondering, is the civil society activism of the first few decades a response of disappointment with the state, post-colonial state, or it was that there was a certain legacy of civil society movement that post-independence, early decades of post-independence India had still inherited? And the theory of the underdeveloped state and the overdeveloped movement, the inheritance of freedom struggle, so to say, in the first few decades that kind of kept pushing. And then when you had this emerging from that disappointment of taking the responsibility of freedom and equality and justice onto oneself, and then eventually moving in the direction of movements then becoming more political, for the lack of better word, in the sense that is being referred to in terms of more electoral politics, trying to get stakeholdership in direct politics because of civil society not working or getting enough things done. So I'm also thinking in terms of not politics versus ethics. I'm siding with Dr. Pandey here that maybe these two converge together in a certain way. But where my question then comes to is it depoliticization, or is it politicization of a certain kind? So allyship of the civil society kind is probably losing its charm, merit, or conviction, because a different kind of allyship, a different kind of politicization is happening, wherein you have the Gen Z, which is politicized, but its core fundamental underlying values of politics have changed. Or you have excessive pockets of politicization, which are catering to politics of polarization, politics of identity, politics of majoritarianism. And in that sense, that robust culture of civil society, of coming out for the other, or fighting for the other, that entire uh, that entire frame has shifted to politicization of a certain kind. And this then I will connect to again the affect bit that was coming up. Leela Gandhi's work in affective communities, where uh, I think that hint is there of how can you move beyond identity to form certain the political friendship and the merit of it, and uh, New India being a product of political friendship of people across different identities to come together and say this is not just about, as you in your own words, this is not because my friend is incarcerated without trial. This is about anybody who's incarcerated without trial. So the question is that if you were to think in terms of then the effective politics of the time, uh, that this may not actually be about the guilt of individuals or the guilt of people wanting to do something. I'm sitting on the other side of the frame where you have a tremendous amount of effect in speaking for your friends, quote unquote, but now you don't have effective communities based of friendship, but you have effective communities of identity. So yeah, so is allyship possible in a time when politics is framed strongly on questions of identity, and in this case, a majoritarian identity? So, do we have the environment conducive for allyship? Uh, and I will rest my question. Actually, a comment masquerading as a question there. Thank you so much.
Again, thank you. Can you hear me and see me? Again, thank you so much. I'm a combination of impressed and moved at how insightful and good these questions are. About your first comment about is it between disappointment with the state and or is it more ideological? It's both. It's definitely both. There is a social movement scholarship has argued and then has also kind of questioned it. But there is a brief sort of period of a romance with the new state, and then the 60s is considered to be this period where all kinds of movements emerge, and with movements allies emerge. So is there an element of disappointment with the state? Yes, there definitely is. But there is a very long history of ideological commitment to, for example, I'll give you an example of the ideological commitment to a party-less democracy. So it's not just that I am disappointed by political parties. The followers of M.N. Roy, the followers of Gandhi, they have an inherent ideal party as a form of mediation between people at large and the government. The left thinks the left is more conducive of parties, but for them party is a whole different thing, right? For the left, party is not the bourgeois democracy parliamentary party. The party is a different vehicle. The party is a social movement in a sense. So there is all of this. So there's definitely a commitment disappointment. Both things are true. As I said, I'm kind of hesitating to comment on the current bit, but I just want to say that I don't agree with all of you that allyship is vanishing somehow. This my instinct is that the impulse to become involved in struggles that are beyond one's immediate interests are a very fundamental feature of democratic life. So, climate activism today is a good example of something that, yes, of course, we all have a stake, but because of its diffusedness, there is a way in which I don't have a direct stake in the way that I might have if I was protesting on a feminist cause. There's a way in which it is, the stake is much more palpable and direct. Queer activism is another example of, the people who are supporting the right to marry for different sexual orientations. Act would come to if it became a right. So I feel like allyship definitely exists. I don't think allyship is vanishing. But of course, I think what all of you are making me think is that the conditions under which allyship is being practiced, the language that it might be using, the way in which it is being done must be completely different for us to kind of not find the old kind of allyship, and for us to be kind of instinctively thinking that or wondering if allyship has reduced. I think allies were present in the anti-CAA movement. People who were not affected, who were part of it, they were present in the farmers movement. There is also like movements attempting to, sometimes failing to, but the anti-caste movement and the left movement trying to sort of come together. So there's also that kind of allyship that one can think about. Now, the generation that you people are talking about, 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s, they are shaped by very particular historical, experiences. They have heard stories of the anti-colonial movement. They are impacted by, influenced by socialism, the emergency, the worry there is about state, about a strong culture of, intellectual engagement with the state. Them have entered long-standing engagement with various political groups, and I'm imagining that maybe today people enter public causes through a different route, and maybe like Suhasini's comment made me think that maybe it has moved from a collective allyship to singular instances of solidarity. But my overall point is that I think that there is my overall point is that the task or the challenge will be to find out where, not whether allies exist, but where they exist. Like what kinds of language are they using today? What roots they have today? But I don't think that sort of democracy is possible. Democratic politics is possible if nobody is willing to care about injustices that do not directly affect them. So that's definitely the case. But I'm glad that these are very much, quite honestly, the things that I was hoping people would think about when I was writing the book.
Thank you for answering that question. And I'd also go back and think about what you've just said about allyship not existing, but perhaps in a different form and maybe existing in places that we're not really looking at. Or maybe it's up against something so strong that it finds itself more in whispers than in loud calls, perhaps. So let's not worry about where it is. Let's worry about how it is, taking from you. We far exceeded the time of this Baithak. This is probably one of the longest Baithaks, one of the longest Baithaks we've had. So we will now have to not take more questions. If people had more questions, I'm sure Dr. Pandey would be willing to share her email ID, and maybe at another instance This book deserves more attention, and I'm sure that it will be, of course, Daak will review it, but I'm sure that it will come up in further discussions, and you'll be able to catch the the scholar somewhere in Delhi and nearby spaces when she's speaking in future. But on that note, we'll close the session. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey, for
Thank
taking for taking out the time, for coming and speaking to such a small set of us who are doing these reading groups and trying to push the envelope for young researchers. And we thoroughly enjoyed talking about your book, reading it, and we're so grateful that you took out 2 hours of your time on a Saturday for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed it. I'm returning energized from all of this conversation. So thank you. I really owe you a gratitude. I'm so happy to have heard all your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank both Sanjukta and Suhasini, committed members of the TheDaak, and for volunteering and reading the book and discussing it with us today. Thank you so much, both of you. You know the work that you do, and we're most thankful for that. I would also like to thank all our participants for coming back to each TheDaak Baithak, especially this one. Thank you so much. We are, I'm from the platform, I'm announcing that we're reducing the frequency of the Baithaks. We were actually meeting up until now, we've been meeting every week. Today is actually our 47th Baithak in 1 year. So the team is rethinking in its processes, and we'll go back to probably reducing the frequencies of Baithak now, and probably we'll come back again in August next month. We've assimilated a lot of conversations, and we want to now kind of sit with them and see how concretely we can bring our scholars into, and whatever we've read and we've learned from all of you, including Dr. Pandey here. So we'll now have the next Baithak sometime in August, and you know our social media to know where we announce these things. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I wish you all. Sakshi is also thanking you for the thought-provoking session. Thank you, everyone, and we'll hopefully meet in August again. And happy weekend, the remaining weekend that there is. This particular Baithak would also be available on our YouTube channel, and in the same social media channels where we announce other things, you'll find a link for it. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.